What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Nesson.com podcast. I'm Ricky Doyle, joined by Mike Cole, and welcoming in Nesson's own Tom Caron, who recently sat down with David Ortiz as part of one of Nesson's special presentations, David Ortiz, The Journey. TC, I know that it was a special interview for you, having covered Ortiz for his entire career. So we'll just we'll walk through this whole thing, the interview, and just covering him in general. But I don't know about you, Mike, but I really want to start off by going back to the beginning, where it all started.
Definitely.
And just kind of taking us back to 2003, the beginning of the David Ortiz era in Boston, and just kind of what you remember about that time, because obviously it was a different state of affairs going on, not only with Ortiz's career, but just the Red Sox in general, Red Sox Nation, just a different feel back then, obviously.
Yeah, no question about that. First of all, thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, that was year 86, right, and counting.
Yeah.
And it was a totally different time. I remember, Johnny Damon had come the year before, and I remember Johnny Damon talking about how, he couldn't believe, he went to a club once with a couple of players, and they stood in line. And Johnny Damon's like, that's not how we roll. We're the Red Sox. And that's really kind of where they were, in 01 and 02. They didn't make the playoffs, in 01 or 02, and just really didn't seem like a team that was going anywhere at that point. The new ownership came in 02, and things started to go in a new direction. So then you go to 03. And they get Ortiz, who was out of work. I mean, Minnesota turned away from him, which is incredible. And I remember talking to him early on. I was a sideline reporter for our game broadcast back then. And, Tom Kelly in Minnesota wanted him to be just a different guy. Wanted him, the Twins' way was, give up the at-bat, move the guy along, situational hitting. As David says, that's all great. But I didn't get here by little slap, base hits to left field and little, trying to ground ball to right to the second baseman to move the runner along. So, he felt he couldn't be who he was. And the story, Pedro went to bat for him with ownership, said you got to get this guy in. So he gets here in 02. He's not playing. Right, Jeremy Giambi, not even Jason Giambi,
yeah, exactly.
Jeremy Giambi is in his way, and Shea Hillenbrand is the third baseman. And Ortiz isn't playing, and he gets a couple of chances, and he's pressing when he gets in, and behind the scenes we find out later he went and asked to be traded, and finally they moved Shea Hillenbrand. And it wasn't immediate. You'd love to say that the sunlight came out and Big Papi hit 5 home runs in the next 6 days. It was still a struggle, but by the end of that year, you knew you had something special. And then, the playoff results that year and then to 04, speak for themselves.
Yeah, we were talking about that this afternoon even, and going over, things we want to talk to you about. People forget how good he was, down the stretch and into the playoffs in 2003. I mean, he had a good series against the A's. He had that big double off of Keith Folk, of all people, that really kind of, I think, started the legacy. And I think that's kind of when people started to really take notice.
Yeah, it was at the 8th inning in Game 4, at Fenway, which was a crazy game. I think it was Sunday.
It was Sunday, sorry, yeah. It was a weekend afternoon
well,
game.
I'll take it to the
I'll take it the whole thing. I mean, they lose the first 2 games in Oakland. People forget about that series, and they come home, and then Saturday night is still burned in my memory as the most insane game I've ever seen. Remember, Eric Burns doesn't touch home plate. And he's arguing with the umpire while Veritek tags him. And I think it might have been, was it Tejada? Whoever it was who came around third base and thought the umpire was granting him home on interference, but the umpire was actually saying you're safe at third. So he starts sauntering home and they tag, and it goes extra innings. And they win that game. And then the Sunday game, which was an afternoon game, 8th inning they're losing. And I remember being on the phone, sort of making plans for the off season. It's about to end. In the 8th inning, he hits it all Folk. They wind up winning that game. We go back to Oakland, no day off. They play Monday night, which was the Derek Lowe gets the final out, and then you go to New York. So you're right. That is where the legacy began. Some big hits down the stretch to get him in there, and then he was pretty big in that Oakland series. He and Manny, that was really when you started to see that sort of 1-2 punch that we saw in 04.
Yeah, he's one of these guys, obviously, that people gravitate towards, too. I mean, just a larger-than-life personality. But, I mean, when you were, in your interactions with him, back in '03 and '04, before he was this like larger than life figure. I mean, he still had the personality, but what do you remember about maybe your first interactions with him, or when did you kind of realize like this guy is more than just a talented baseball player? He's just
was he like the same guy too?
You know what I mean?
Yeah, he was, because he really did live larger than life.
Right.
But he was always funny. I remember in '03, I don't know why I always remember this. After a game, he'd had a big hit, and we're all trying to get the interview with him, and he was like, I got to make this quick because my wife's waiting for it and she's going to kill me. And this guy who's like this, big-time Major League slugger. But, what I always found interesting was the dynamic between him and Manny, because we always talked about he and Manny being the great 1-2 combination, both from the Dominican Republic. But they were never best friends.
Right.
They were great complementary hitters. But the difference was, and it was Johnny Damon, not my word, Johnny Damon, who called them the idiots. You know what I mean? Manny was the idiot savant. Manny really was see ball, hit ball. If you can get one by me, good luck. Whereas Ortiz just had almost a photographic memory. We talk about it in the film in 13 when Benoit tries to get the splitter by him and he remembered the pitch from earlier in the season. But that's who he was. He could remember pitch sequences and. This guy's got this, and talking to other players at the time, look for this, and I think when he became a dedicated DH,
Right, exactly.
Over the next year, he could really focus in on the hitting aspect, and he was, a genius in the profession, as far as hitting goes.
Is that something that you think he almost doesn't get enough credit for in terms of? I think it's one of those things where you look at him, and this is a guy who's known for these big clutch hits. He's known for being a big personality, and I think that kind of overshadows how good he is and how much time and devotion he spends to his craft. I think that's something I don't think people realize is how smart he is as a hitter too.
And how hard it actually is to be a DH.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think that gets overlooked. People think of it as so much easier because all you got to do is worry about 4 or 5 at-bats. But, I've talked to 1,000 baseball players, slight exaggeration, but who have said over the years, God, I hate DHing.
Right.
Because if you're in an 0 for 10, there's nothing you can do to make you feel like you're contributing. You can't make a great play in the field. You can't go out and play defense. You're 0 for 10. That's it. That's all you get to do. And it takes a special guy to be able to go. Sure, he can go in the cage inside and take cuts between, and that's what he does, and stay hot and stay ready and look at video. He's got all that. But it's also flipping a switch every couple of innings. You're not in the game, you're not in the game. Okay, now go up with 2 men on and 2 outs and make something happen. Very few. You look around baseball now, not many teams have a real DH anymore. Right? They cycle through a catcher and a first base and an outfielder, right? And they give guys rest by having him as a DH. He's a DH through and through. He has taken that position and elevated it to something special.
The guy's like a sponge. I mean, that's kind of what I picked up from the interview that you had is just, it's amazing how he can recall what he learned from specific players, former teammates. I know he talks a little bit about with Manny, like learning to, maybe if you take 3 pitches right down the middle now, you could be setting them up for later.
Right.
And then also, an interaction with Jason Varitek is, when he had a bigger bat and just all this stuff, it just kind of, he absorbs it and then puts it into play. It's
even there's one we didn't get into much in the film that he talked about in the interview, and what was Adrian Gonzalez, who wasn't here that long and isn't thought of very fondly in his time here. But Gonzalez was a real devotee of video. He spent hours in the video room. And in that stretch, when he was coming out of the struggles of 09 and 010, Ortiz kind of gravitated to the video room with Gonzalez.
Right.
Really, if you look, the influence Gonzalez had on him at that point in his career was kind of learning to go opposite field again. Because when Ortiz first came here, the monster was his friend.
Right.
He would pepper that wall. And then, then you start thinking about the quintessential David Ortiz home run. It's the mash over the bullpen, right? Every year trying to get to that Ted Williams seat. And so, again, a guy who was just, even at that stage, now you're, 8, 9, 10 years into a major league career, pretty successful one, but you're still willing to reinvent yourself and learn from new guys. So yeah, he is a sponge. I mean, there's no question.
We'll rewind a little bit. What's the biggest thing that stands out for you about him in regard to that 2004 season? Like when you look back on 2004, you look back on the impact that Ortiz had, what stands out? What's the lasting image for you from that?
Well,
that
I mean, it's the back-to-back walk-offs in games 4 and 5. I mean, just the obvious answer, but I'd love to tell you that Bill Miller. We look back at it now, right? And Dave Roberts steals second base, and Bill Miller drives him in, and church bells ring, and they win a World Series. But the truth of it is that tied the game in the ninth inning, and they had, Charles Steinberg, who was working for the Red Sox at the time, the story is he had written like 5 pages of what to tell the fans, like how to, for next year, because that was as bad as it got, right? Getting swept by the Yankees. And I won't name names of analysts who were with me at that point. I was a studio host. But, that game 4, he wins it. It was at the 12th inning. He wins it in extra innings. And, an analyst looks over and goes, "Oh, would they just lose? They're not going to win 4 in a row. There's no way in hell you're going to win 4 in a row. Let's just get on with our lives."
It's agonizing yourself.
You're just dragging it on. And then, and that was a Saturday night game. No, that was Sunday night game, right? Saturday was the 19-8 loss. Sunday, I'll always remember that. The pregame show on Sunday, nobody on Yankee Way. Everyone's watching the Patriots. Patriots had a 4 o'clock game. Everybody's watching the Pats. Scalpers are selling their tickets below face value for Game 4 of the ALCS with the Yankees. They come back and tie it up, and it was a weird, 4 o'clock start time on Monday.
Right,
it was a Columbus Day or something, whatever it was. And, so you've been there really late. You're right back there for noon, getting ready for the show. And he hits the home run. I don't remember if the home run was Game 4 and the base hit was Game 5. Okay, so the walk-off base hit in Game 5. And again, the same analyst. Oh, Jesus! Come on, again. But that was when you sort of start. Yeah, when they start thinking about we're going to go to New York now, suddenly, So those two, because again, Dave Roberts steals the base, and that's still the most incredible sequence. The 3 pickoff attempts, and then how close. Terry Francona used to always say, every time I watch the video, it gets a little closer. He goes, someday I'm going to watch it. He's going to be out, and I got fired that offseason, But you can't overlook the fact that none of that matters if Ortiz doesn't deliver in extra innings. It's just like none of that series matters if they lose to the Cardinals, which he talks about in the documentary. He says, we knew we had him. He's like, it was an afterthought.
And I mean, speaking of Dave Roberts, Mike and I were talking earlier how he's still a legend around here from basically stealing that one base. So you look at David Ortiz, and it's like, if he does nothing after 2004, he's still a legend in these parts. But then he goes on to have the career that he does, and it's just, it's pretty amazing, especially when, you talked about him reinventing himself, and then next thing you know, it's 2013.
Well, I know, so I'm gonna stop you there because, I don't know how many sisters and brothers do you guys have?
I got 2.
Yeah, I got 2 brothers.
And where do you fit in?
I'm the youngest.
I'm the oldest.
All right, so none of us are a middle child, okay? But that poor 017, okay, is the middle child of sports, all right? No, you were jumping ahead to 2013, and we all do.
Well, that 017 is the
But that 017, and guys will tell you it was the best team I ever played on.
Right.
04 was magic. 13, I'm not sure they were the best team in baseball. I'm not sure they were one of the 5 best teams in baseball, but they rose with the emotion. 07, they were the best team in baseball. And even though the Indians almost knocked them off. But if you remember that first round series with the Angels that year, and then into the Indian series, what he and Manny did was incredible. I just remember we were building graphics every night, and I'm going back to our producers. Double check those numbers. There's no 1482 OPS and what. There's no way. So I just he really it was him and Manny together. You know what I mean? But that was as impressive a postseason run by a 1-2 punch that I've ever seen. And then you take it to another level in 13 because everything back to Patriots Day that he did was just incredible.
Yeah, I think that. He was clearly going to be a Boston sports legend, but you're right. From April through what he did with the marathon, and then to finish that off by hitting basically it seemed like 1,000 in the World Series.
It's amazing when you look at everybody else's numbers too in comparison.
Right.
Talk about jumping off the page.
Right. That's where he earned the statue, right? That entire.
That's
season.
where he earns the statue. You're exactly right. That's where Hall of Fame, whatever the baseball stuff is going to be, I've been saying for a while now that out by whatever gate that is, where the Ted Williams and the teammates, there's going to be the statue of him pointing up to his mother as he crosses home plate. That's going to be the statue. And 2013 is what cemented it. You forget that Saturday game, the This Is Our Bleeping City game, was his first game of the year. He'd been hurt. Yeah. He wasn't with the team. Yeah. He wasn't playing. And he had been down in Pawtucket. And, we all remember what happened. I was on the air when the bombings occurred, and we kept going for a while. And when they came back from just the way the schedule worked out, right? They were gone for 3 days in Cleveland. They come home that Thursday night, and then Friday is the shelter in place, right? And the game's canceled. And, I remember we did the pregame show on the field that Saturday afternoon the next day, and it was kind of a cloudy morning, and it literally like half hour before the game, like the skies kind of broke and the sun came out. It really felt, you guys remember, it's just surreal. Yep. It was like the sun is shining on Boston again,
Right.
And then he grabs the mic and does his speech, and and then in our post-game show, the FCC had come out and absolved him of any fines for saying the F-bomb. We stand with David Ortiz. And then what they do in the World Series, I think it was backing it up. The piece in the documentary, the journey, when he talks about the Benoit splitter. And I, from my perspective, I'm up in the press box. We're doing the post-game show down on Yankee Way. And, they basically had nothing going in Game 1 offensively. Mm-hmm. They've had nothing going through 7 innings in Game 2. You're on the verge of going down 2-0. You're going to go to Detroit. If you don't get swept, you're going to lose in 5. So I remember before going down to the set, I just went down and stood with fans up on the first base concourse side because I'm like, it's the last game of the year at Fenway, right? They're not coming back from Detroit, And I thought he totally mismanaged that on the Detroit side because he was just bringing in all the relievers. Like, you had a 4-run lead. You should have just, put a guy in, let him get through it. And, and then Ortiz hits the grand slam, which is, looking for the splitter because he had struck out on the splitter earlier in the year. And the first pitch, not like he gets to settle in. The first pitch is the splitter, and he's ready for it. Who does that?
Right. The crazy thing is, too, and I think this is one of his biggest impacts. There's 2 things I think are huge, but one of them is it's almost it's tough to explain just how much you expect it now. I think we take that for granted. Yeah. It's like he comes to the plate, 5-1, bases loaded, huge spot, really the season on the line. You're like, there's a pretty good chance he hits a grand slam here, and he hits a grand slam.
It was almost an expectation. Whereas you rewind that a decade before all his heroics. The expectation is that the Red Sox fall flat.
And that's the David Ortiz era.
Well, that's
the transformation, right? Basically. And that's what we're going to talk about in the second documentary. But really, when you talk about what David Ortiz has done here, he took, I was explaining it to someone in Chicago because they're talking about the Cubs, and the Cubs have always been the lovable loser. They lose, they stink, until recently. That wasn't Boston. Boston figured out a way. The Red Sox figured out a way to get you one step closer. It can't happen. It can't be worse than Buckner.
Right.
And before that, my father said it can't be worse than Johnny Pesky double pumping the relay throw. And on it went. It can't get worse than Bucky Dent. And then you get to Bill Buckner. It can't get worse than Bill Buckner. And then Grady leaves Pedro in walking back out. Well, it can't get. It always got worse. And the difference now is, and it's not just him. But his time here. We transformed into, Poppy will do it. Sure. Not a great slam.
Like him, and I think to pretty much the same extent, the Patriots. But I think largely a lot of it is Ortiz has really not only changed the Red Sox as an organization, but it's changed this entire fan base where we went from self-loathing, expecting the worst, to insufferable, cocky. Everybody else hates us because. Yeah.
Well, because of that,
because you expect to win. I think that's a mentality that really starts with David Ortiz. I think more than anything else.
Absolutely, because he's the only one left from 04.
That too.
Right?
Yeah.
He's the only one left from 03. Everyone says the only one left from 04, but I go back to 03 because he was here at the lowest of the lows, right? I mean, that's the Aaron Boone home run. I was on the bus coming back. That's as bad as it got. I was covering the team from afar when Bill Buckner happened, but I was on the Red Sox plane back from New York that night. And that's as bad as it gets. Season just ended, extra innings. Tim Wakefield was at Logan. Most guys took the bus back to Fenway. I used to get up at Logan to get a ride. And Wake did the same thing, and Tim's sitting there with that look in his eyes. Am I Buckner? Am I the new Buckner? And that was the feeling. Like this 03 collapse will be looked at for decades.
Right.
Because that's what would have happened if they kept losing, right? But the 04 erases all of that. 03 becomes the prelude to 04. You don't even think of that as a disaster anymore.
Yeah.
Right? 03 is the starting line for 04.
Yeah.
But when at the time it was,
oh my God,
we just exhausted so much energy into that one series.
Right. We'll never get back there.
Exactly,
Grady Little gets fired after going to Game 7 of the ALCS. It's just.
And then they're down 3-0. Next, it's unbelievable. Really, just when you step back and really reflect on it, it's insane what they did over the course of.
And I was there. That's the old Yankee Stadium. You know what I mean? I'm standing outside the locker. I'm the sideline reporter, so I'm one of the first guys in. And then, all the plastic is over the things for the celebration, and the champagne's being wheeled out before we go in, and just guys with vacant looks in their eyes, and you're like, that's what it meant. Not just for the fan base. That's what it meant to play for the Red Sox. You know what I mean? They knew that history. They were all part of it. And he erased it. They erased it, the following year. And then, the ownership used to joke, anybody can stumble into one World Series.
Right.
You know what I mean? Winning again in 07 validated that this was a great team. And again, the 13 one, I didn't think it could ever feel like 04 again. But if you guys remember, that Game 6 of the World Series at Fenway, because they hadn't done it at Fenway. Running around that day, I went to the ballpark like 11 a.m. for an 8 o'clock game, and there were people everywhere.
Yep.
There was it felt like 04 all over again because of what 13 had been.
Right.
It was incredible. And that speech, the speech he gave the team in the dugout before the Gomes home run, we all thought he was fire and brimstone and reaming into him, and then the guys tell you, no, he's telling us to calm down and play the game the way we can.
Yeah, the audio of it, and it's
incredible.
The polar opposite, basically.
Right, right. So it's, the great thing about what we did with the Journey is, he was really thoughtful. He gave great answers. I don't know how he's doing it. That was a game day.
Well,
when we taped it, it was 2 days after. If you remember, he fouled the ball off his shin and been helped off the field. Yep. We're like, there goes the interview because it was all set up. There goes the season. There goes the interview. And then he winds up playing, and he still does the interview. And it was, it had to be close to 2 hours long that we sat down. And I'm like, how is he, how many other requests like this? How many 2-hour interviews is he doing? And he went out that night. Arizona was in town. And he went 3 for 4 and hit a home run. After basically, telling me his life story for 2 hours. And, all right, it's 4 o'clock. I got to go to work.
Yeah, he's getting dragged in so many different directions in this last season. I think honestly, maybe he would think about announcing that again. Which I can't imagine what that must be like. So it was the thing that surprised you the most, and watching this is what surprised me, is just how open he was. I mean, he's got so many things going on, but to get there and get so introspective and just so deep and really, it seemed like you guys connected. And
I've been around since his start, so I think there's a comfort level and a trust level he has in me doing the interview. But I went in. You guys were saying this yesterday at a meeting. Is I went in with 3 plans. I mean, what happens? You guys have been there. I haven't done it yet, but guys who glance at their watch 10 minutes into the interview, just from body language.
Exactly.
Okay, I got to speed this up because I'm not going to have him for an hour and a half. So I've got Plan A is an hour and a half. Plan B is 45 minutes. Plan C is 20 minutes. Because you can't spend 20 minutes talking about 03 and 04. And then he says, okay, I got to wrap it up. And you say, okay, real quickly, the marathon.
Right.
By the way, before you leave. So he got open pretty quickly, and I think I was able to get him thinking about certain things that he hadn't thought about. It was cool that our guys had it set up where I could roll some video for him to look at, which was pretty cool that we showed his reaction. My favorite point of the whole interview, for all the deep stuff, is still that Pedroia back and forth. If you guys have seen it, where he says he looks like what's her name from Good Times, the mother from Good Times. And he's looking down, and I say, look at that, and he looks up and just bursts out laughing. So it was, it was great because really, I mean, I almost felt like I had to say at the end of it, okay, you got to go to work now.
Yeah.
Let's wrap this up because I really think, and I'm sure he's doing this with other people. I just don't think he's doing it all the time with other people. It was a moment when he sat down for 90 minutes, 2 hours, and really thought about his career and his place in this city and what it means. And he's going to do that a lot this winter.
Right.
He's going to get asked, to look back, and I think we can all look back with perspective. It's pretty hard to do in August.
Yeah.
Which is what he did.
Especially when there's so much to come. I mean, it's not like they're limping to the finish line here.
Right, and at that point we didn't know.
Still writing
At that point it's a dogfight,
Yeah.
and now they're just, they're running away with it. It's incredible. Yeah. And doesn't it almost feel like people have asked me how's he doing it this last year? For one thing, I think everything we've talked about, how he to me is the ultimate clutch hitter, has made this season the ultimate clutch performance, right? He knows the end is in sight. So it's almost like he's willing himself.
Right.
He would have missed. With the heel, everything's barking. I know he's hurt. He's told me as much off the record. He'd have probably missed another 30 games this year if it wasn't his last season.
Right.
But, I think he's just strapping it on and getting it out there and going to work. I also think the team kind of understands we've got to do this for him. I think the young guys really know that this is something special. Imagine if we could win it all in Ortiz's last year. Imagine if we could beat the Cubs. You talk about being the most hated team. What if you're the team that stops Theo Epstein's Cubs?
I was going to say, that was another cool part of the documentary, that was him looking at the film of him teaching Mookie back in spring training and saying how good he was. And just, for all the things we just mentioned that he's doing this year, to also throw on your plate, oh, by the way, we have this young up-and-coming roster that we'd like you to kind of show
you
the
can mentor.
ropes.
You don't mind being a big brother.
And he's embracing that as well.
Totally. In fact, last night, Betts, after another 3 hits, was talking about that, how Ortiz is the one who got me to relax, play the game like I know how, stop. When you get to the majors, the biggest difference everyone will tell you is the amount of information available. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I've had guys tell me, Buchholz went through this as a pitcher. You learn so much about the opponent that you're, oh my God, he's good. They just showed me he can strike out with a slider. He can go upstairs. He's nasty. At some point, you got to go back to trust what you can do. And a lot of young guys have trouble with that, because they will give you so much information. Information is important, and you want to be prepared. But you don't want analysis to paralysis. You don't want to be so worried about the strengths of the other guy, whether you're a hitter facing a pitcher or vice versa, that you don't trust your own stuff. And Betts last night, after 3 hits, said, it was Ortiz really pulled me aside and said, you got to play the game the way you did in the minors. You got to react to what's happening. Don't overthink it.
Yep, not surprising. 9th inning of his career, he's still going strong.
That's fun. Well, he could actually have an impact on the Red Sox' future success, even when he's not playing, by virtue of these lessons.
And I'm sure he'll be around. Tech's around, Pedro's around. They've done a really nice job of having these guys around spring training, and I'm sure that'll be part of what Ortiz does in the off season, and go to the Dominican Academy they have and help the next generation. But what the interesting thing to me going forward now over the next 10 days is, all of a sudden, the magic number's shrinking by the day.
Right.
They could have this locked up by the time they come home, which none of us thought was possible. Where that weekend really could become a celebration of Ortiz. Because we've talked about that. What if that last game you were facing elimination? Or,
and he's up in
you
the
can
nine,
only have so much.
Yeah,
you can only have a 2-hour ceremony when you got to win the damn game to get to the playoffs. They could have that all wrapped up. Probably will the way they're going. And then it'll be cool because then you really don't have to have that conflicting, we got to win for the playoffs. We got, let it be an Ortiz pregame show.
Get him off his feet, too, a little bit.
Right. Well, that won't go over well.
No, I get him a
Friday's
lay
game
up
if he doesn't play.
All right. Speaking of wrapping up, TC, thanks for the time. We really appreciate
thanks,
it.
man.
And we don't have the camera, but this is what you pulled on Ortiz to ask him, to give a message or what he would like his lasting legacy to be in the David Ortiz, the Journey film. So I'm going to ask you to not look into a camera, but what is your lasting memory of David Ortiz's career, having been someone that's been there every step of the way? Because there's just so much to pick and choose.
There's
all
so
of which we
much.
just went over.
That's a great question. I will, to me, it is, how many kids, and I told them this, we didn't use it, but I said this to him at one point in the interview, how many batting gloves has he ruined around New England because little kids are spitting into him every time they step up to the plate? Just how many people. This guy, on first blush, couldn't be more different than us in New England. And yet he comes here, and now he's like the ultimate New Englander, right? He and Gronk are drinking iced coffee in commercials, right? I mean, he's bumping Dunkin', which is the ultimate, when you do a Dunkin' Donuts commercial, you've made it as a New Englander, And when he says in the interview that, the fans here in Boston are just like the fans at home, they demand the best. I mean, here's this guy who's larger than life, and has, the bling he wears is more than my net worth. and yet he blends in as one of us. And forget everything he does on the field, because that speaks for itself. But he comes here and not only fits in, but kind of becomes the ultimate New Englander, blue-collar guy. He says that, right? These fans just want you to work hard every night, And you think of a Cam Neely in the Bruins, right, who just understood that you do whatever, Cam Neely going through with his hip and his knee and everything he had to go through to get back on the ice. People have no idea. I was rambling here, but I was at a charity event right around the All-Star break, and he came in for the parents, and he came up, and I was talking to him, and it was a day off. The Red Sox didn't play that day. And he smelled of ointment and liniment, and, he had clearly come from hours with the trainer on an off day.
Right.
People have no idea, how much he puts in just to get back on the field. So, to answer that question, the lasting legacy memory that Ortiz will have to me is, how he came here kind of with an image of, again, you said at the very beginning of this, larger than life, right? With his elbow out of a Bentley, you know what I mean? That's who we thought David Ortiz was rolling in, and there's certainly part of him is that, and yet he's one of us. He's the best of us. He's the guy who works the hardest and is able to craft a career and a legacy because he worked harder and spent more time thinking and training and preparing than anybody else.
Fascinating player.
Yep.
Fascinating career.
Yeah.
Fascinating documentary.
That said, he's got a lot of bling. I mean, he
you
might fit in with us, but he's got more bling than all of us.
I mean,
I'll tell you a story.
There's
There's a story, allegedly, one of the World Series rings, I think it was 07, they kind of showed him what it was, here's the ring, what do you think? And the story goes, he said, it needs more bling. And, here's this big white gold gaudy. And so they lifted the face of it and put a ring of diamonds. And if you see the 07 ring, it's got that ring of diamonds. It didn't have it until David Ortiz said, come on now. It needs more bling. I'm not going to wear something like that. But if you put more diamonds on it, I might wear it.
I'd like to see what he has in store for 2016 then. I think he's going to go out with a bang.
Yeah, well, maybe it'll just be him, the face of him.
Yeah,
it'll just be the ruby David Ortiz on the face of the ring.
At this point, that makes sense. TC, thanks a lot. Really
Thanks,
We
guys.
appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. I'm NESN.com's Ricky Doyle. He's Mike Cole. Thanks for joining us, everyone.